Hello there, hope you're well. If you haven't seen part 1, then do check it out. I'll include a link in the description. But the upshot from the previous episode is that I've been in conversation with the philosophical magazine After Dinner Conversation. They teach philosophy through a series of short stories and then discussion questions. And so in the previous episode, I read out one of the stories, went through some of the questions, and then gave my thoughts on them as well as on the magazine more generally. It was good fun doing it, and it seems to have been well received, so I thought I'd do another one. And so that's what I'm going to do in this episode. I'm going to read through one of the stories and then go for the questions. I won't discuss the magazine itself, because I've done that in the previous episode, so do check that out if you haven't seen it. As per last time, I'll include a promo code in the description that will get you your first month edition for free. So do check that out. Go and check out their website after this. So, without further ado, on to the story. The Seven Absent Sins by Nathan Ahlgrim. The compiled knowledge of the 89 species in the Galactic Confederation of Intelligences has never been a priority for Earth-bound scholars. Our collective ignorance has metastasized ever since the declaration of Terran egress, which has now kept us in isolation for a full 100 years. With our retreat from the Confederation came the effort to suppress all access to galactic knowledge, in a vain attempt to establish a distinctly and purely human society. It was a defensive measure which I believe has been the primary cause of our cultural and scientific stagnation. We of the Jesuit order have been unwavering in our advocacy for transparency and universal access for all scholars to the work of our galactic brethren in our tradition of scientific study in the service of God. However, my hours locked away with the Encyclopedia of Sentient Species have forced me to appreciate the reticence of our various leaders to open the galactic library to human study. Like windswept seeds, I fear the motes of this knowledge will take root as an invasive species in our collective psyche. The newly accessible histories of the GCI have stimulated a glut of reports from our order as we search for lessons that humanity can draw from the Confederation. The Confederate scientific prowess is transparently instructive, but so too are the hierarchy of and partnerships between member species. My colleagues have since published reports on these and other notable features of the GCI. Some have noted the enduring opportunity for all member species to self-determine, which is largely self-evident given the ease of the Terran egress. Others focused on the incredible diversity among the species, with sentience appearing in systems we would not consider biological in our classical, if limited, definition. The publishing boom on galactic knowledge came and went close to a year ago. I have delayed releasing my report because I fear its consequences. My goal was to scrutinize our galactic companions to inform our own morality. I have studied the carnivores, herbivores, and mineralivores. I have reflected on the warmongers and pacifists. Among them, I have found models of a more virtuous humanity. Sin plagues humanity, none more so than the 7 cardinal sins canonized by our pontiff so many centuries ago. Humans seeking God are tempted by these sins. I, myself, am pulled towards immorality, and through denial of my base nature, I have come to know Him. Temptation towards these cardinal sins does not coexist with sentience as reliably as I originally believed as an ignorant and biased human scholar. Although we have always been taught that man is sinful by nature, I do not think I was alone in my assumption that man was meant to encompass any and all sentient species. Once a species can react to, internalize, and control their environment, how could sin not follow? To control is to take ownership, and to take ownership is to wrest control for our Creator. This was the inevitable progression, or so I thought. The following is a collection of exemplary species who are incapable of a certain sin by their very design. A common feature is the removal of certain choices. Although they all maintain some level of what humans consider free will, many are restricted. They may be unable to move with intent, but it frees them to live with intention. Their lives are alien in the truest sense of the word. I fear they cannot teach us how to be righteous, for their lives are unattainable for any human. but I submit that their very existence demands a restructuring of our moral code and perhaps even to our relationship with the divine. Species 14. Lumocelia of Sigma 3. Absent sin, wrath. Wrath is perhaps the easiest sin to imagine as absence in a species. Without resource pressure or mate competition, there would be little reason to develop the capacity to harm your brother. However, nearly every species finds some reason, provoked or petty, to harbour wrathful thoughts and actions. The Lumocelia are a soft-bodied, amorphous species, largely restricted to the humid equatorial region of their home planet. Boulder fields covered in a moss-like carpet serve as their primary habitat. The equivalent to an adult in their species is entirely immobile, leading the exploratory GCI survey team to be skeptical of their sentience. And yet the deep learning algorithm housed in the routine observation satellite stationed above one of the Lumocelian colonies deciphered a rich language and culture expressed through the bioluminescent displays emitted from the soft protuberances of all adult individuals. Given the relative slowness of the Lumocelian metabolism when compared to the native moss-like growth, their exclusive food source, resource competition and habitat crowding is wholly absent. They do not steal, they do not war. Once the GCI's algorithm successfully reproduced the Lumocelian language, its inquiry into native conflict was met by utter confusion. No member of this species could even deny the existence of wrath, because the entire concept was too foreign for them to comprehend. Their entire adult lives, as all interviewed individuals soberly reported, is devoted to their cultural luminescent displays. Nowhere in these displays appear messages of hatred or violence. A commonly shared aesthetic beauty is the convergent point for this species' entire culture. Species 76. Megaploidorans of Nubin 1. Absent sin, lust. Sexual reproduction and lust are inextricably linked in many human traditions. Lust is typically described as a sinful byproduct of a necessary biological drive, something to be controlled but never erased. However, just as an absence of resource competition seems to have removed the capacity for wrath in the Lumocelia, the absence of sexual pressure has endowed the Megaloploidorans with a complete absence of lust. The Megaploidorans are technologically advanced species. Their radially symmetrical bodies resemble a mobile humanoid anemone. Their reproduction deviates from the evolutionary trajectory common to most species in that it has never been restricted to a single member of each sex. Contrary to successful human fertilization, which requires millions of gametes from a single male, even though only one gamete provides genetic material, a megaploidoran reproductive event requires a single gamete from thousands of individuals. The first observation of their fertilization event was so foreign to visiting GCI observers that it was first interpreted as a cultural display. It is linked to their lunar cycle, and it is automatic. Every member of the species spontaneously releases a gamete into the atmosphere, which likely accounts for the fact that all residential and commercial structures are entirely without a roof. Chemotaxic attraction induces the formation of 1 to 4 gamete clouds across their planet. No member of the Megaploidoran species forewarned their GCI observers because the fertilization event is an important but emotionally neutral occurrence, no more noteworthy than the renewal of a business contract. Note: space travel is all but impossible for this species as a result of their reproductive mechanism. The minimum population needed for the birth of a new generation is impractical for spaceflight to the point of being impossible in practice. Behavioral and therefore cultural sexuality is impossible, since anonymity permeates every aspect of the sexual reproductive cycle. These beings are freed from lust by their inability to link sexuality with any entity smaller than their entire species. I confess to temptations of the flesh. At times these temptations are made more persistent under my vow of celibacy in service to my order. And yet I do take comfort that I can make the choice to abstain from reproduction, whereas the Megaploidorans are compelled to participate. Species 53. Agenesis of the debris field surrounding X in B. Absent sin, greed. How charitable even humans become when their survival depends on another. The giving spirit of Christ is never more prevalent than in times of tragedy, when communities become fully interdependent and can only survive from the summed work of their brethren. Sadly, demonstrations of such selfless production are generally restricted to periods of disaster or poverty on earth. The periods of abundance are the ones that stimulate greed. It is for this reason that I searched the encyclopedia for a species without greed, expecting to find one who was ascetic by necessity from a world choked with resources. My assumptions were again proven misguided. The species I found to be unfettered by greed is the agenesis, self-perpetuating automata which range from a decimeter to tens of meters in diameter, all roughly spherical. They number in the low thousands, residing in the silicon-rich debris fields orbiting their home star. Most models of species evolution suggest that the agenesis are the product of a singularity event from an earlier biological species which sought to obtain immortality through the sacrifice of their original forms. Although not a biological species as such, they perpetuate the culture of their biological ancestors. The true intelligence of the agenesis was inadvertently unveiled when the GCI observation team removed a small automaton to investigate its construction. Such an act of capturing any sentient life is, of course, expressly forbidden within the GCI, but the team acted before agenesis sentience was recognized. Immediately upon the automaton's disappearance behind the bulkhead of the GCI ship, the agenesis swarm began fabricating replacement parts for the ship and propelling them towards its cargo bay. They were, it was soon discovered, bartering for the safe return of their compatriot. The automaton was returned in short order. When the observation team returned after a period of 9 Earth years, they were greeted by a reenactment of the event, a ritual practiced by the agenesis to teach their newly constructed members about the importance of trade and the fragility of their continued existence. The removal of that one individual provoked such a panic because each agenesis is responsible for synthesizing a single molecular compound that is necessary for the repair and rejuvenation of itself and its neighbors. The resulting division of labor makes every individual an obligatory component of the species' survival. To withhold its molecular production would be to commit a murder-suicide of genocidal proportions. Nothing can be gained by an individual agenesis from hoarding its product. Greed is absent in this abiotic species. Species 16. Sulphurians of Triquel 2, largest moon. Absent sin, gluttony. The pleasures of life provided by our Creator so easily mutate into sins of the flesh. Sin is defined by a matter of degree. Gluttony is a constant temptation by the human body, as we are driven by our baser instincts to gather and indulge. Modern interpretations of this sin acknowledge gluttony tempts us in many forms. Classically, gluttony was defined as the overconsumption of foodstuffs. The precise opposite behavior is also gluttony in the moral sense. Those ascetics and fanatics who forgo all but the minimal sustenance similarly overconsume what they wrongly interpret as control. The sin of gluttony shuns the balance prescribed to us by our Creator. In the Sulphurians, the Creator's balance is immutable. Mature members of the species are another example of sinlessness facilitated by a removal of choice. Mineral-rich vents at the ocean floor are their singular food source, the output of which has been estimated to be more than 1,000 times the nutrition needs of the population at its peak. Sulphurians metabolize the vent exhaust to grow and secrete a rigid shell. Ocean currents dictate the whorls and overall morphology of the shell, which is reminiscent of a conch. The size and shape of the shell are not known to have any bearing on the success or rank of the individual. Sulphurian biology prevents over- or underconsumption of the only available food source. Nutrient absorption is an unconscious process governed by a chemical reaction in their digestive system. Ocean vents provide a glut of resources, but the Sulphurians cannot glut themselves, since once their needs are met, they are physically incapable of consuming more. Gluttony is often tied to greed, as overconsumption often requires a hoarding of resources. Sadly, the Sulphurians are still vulnerable to the greed of ideas, jealously hoarding their intellectual material. Of the many joys available to the Sulphurians, however, including subsonic symphonies, release of their young and elegant proofs of fluid dynamics, consumption is not one of them. Consumption is rote, it is instinctive, and it is self-limiting. Gluttony has no meaning to them. Species 40. Perpetuum of Rendin 9. Absent sin, sloth. Sloth is a constant temptation for any God-fearing individual, a sin ever more enabled by a relentless technological advancement. As soon as there is unoccupied time, all but the most disciplined disciple will spend that time at rest, shirking the opportunity to help their brethren or strengthen their spirit. Humans long ago separated effort from survival, which in part explains the modern epidemic of mindless and fruitless sloth. Not all advanced species are afforded the opportunity of complete rest. Although unpalatable to the human taste, it is ultimately to the species' spiritual benefit. The Perpetuum are a unique case in the GCI in that they are a sentient species fully residing inside a larger, less cognitively advanced creature. Similar to the mutualistic relationship between humans and their resident gut microbes, the Perpetuum are rooted within the cavernous digestive system of their host, the gargantuan and slow-moving Montipede, roams the forest of Rendon 9 as the only fauna on the surface of the planet. Individually, Perpetuum are fiercely territorial. The health of their host is dependent on continuous and active repair of the digestive lining, which is divided into hexagonal territories approximately 30 square centimeters. Such precise parceling of territories is believed to be biological in origin, being the exact size and shape of a Perpetuum's 6 outstretched hands. The species likely evolved in response to the low-quality diet of their hosts, and their technological complexity now enables their host to consume any and all available biotic material. Once a territory is established, Perpetuum permanently root themselves in place. Labor can therefore not be divided or reallocated amongst individuals. The most powerful and revered Perpetuum is bound by the same menial tasks at the same rate as the lowest in their number. Truly, the unceasing effort has benefited the spiritual development of these people hidden from the outside world. Their tradition is to withdraw into their manual labor in times of distress or uncertainty, which has facilitated the continuation of their culture through paradigmatic shifts that would trigger calamity in human communities. Note: the Perpetuum unwittingly asserted their sentience to the GCI by their attempts to communicate with their hosts. Within a period of approximately 150 Earth years, 0.7 local years, the Perpetuum communities in all 6 of the presently living Montipede began broadcasting wideband electromagnetic signals in hope of reaching the deaf ears of their host. At the time, their oral traditions held the Montipede as their creator/godhead. The Montipede, having no cognitive capacity to perceive these messages, did not respond. However, their efforts opened a conversation between Perpetuum populations. Although these events triggered a cataclysmic rift in their underlying philosophy, it was this communication effort that enabled the Perpetuum to be recognized and ultimately accepted by the GCI. Species 7. The Solocrium of Nedric 3. Absent sin. Envy. Envy resides in any comparison between ourselves and our neighbors. No matter their standing, it seems the curse of psychology to covet another's wealth, social standing, life partner, or some other facet out of our reach. I was not surprised, therefore, to find an utter lack of envy in the Solocrium, as it had evolved without the ability to compare. Not only was it the only sentient entity on Nedric 3, but it was the only life form on the planet of any kind. The Solocrium was singular, and to entrench in its isolated psychology to learn envy after contact by the GCI. This is not to paint the Solocrium as a passive creature. Its 8 multi-jointed appendages were in constant motion, reshaping its rocky environment. What began as a utilitarian construction of channels and dams to reroute the continent's water flow gradually evolved into intricate sculptural and engineering feats. When the Solocrium desired a new facade or artistic expression, It objectively evaluated the project to be possible or impossible. Without a neighbour to create the impossible, it was saved from envy. As previously mentioned, its psychology was so deeply rooted in its isolation that extraplanetary colonization failed to introduce this sin into its life. Over 57 Earth years, Nedric III was colonized by the technologically superior Brexis species. The Brexis are renowned among the GCI for their mastery of advanced metallurgy and infamously barred from GCI membership. Their blanket disregard for native species on any planet they colonize is fundamentally antithetical to precepts of the GCI. The Locrium observed the mile-high spires and geodesic domes following the Brexis occupation with awe, but it never coveted any of its colonizers' creations. Its admiration remained even when the Brexis barred it from entering any and all of their newly constructed habitats. Slocum deferred to the obvious technological superiority of the Brexis as they systematically monopolized all available resources. Nedric III is now entirely a Brexis world, and the destruction of the Slocum serves to remind all God-fearing species that morality in the face of evil often ends in martyrdom. In my months of active meditation, never did I uncover a species free of the final cardinal sin. Sentience breeds pride, that coveting of oneself. We are made in the image of God, but then we become makers and view ourselves as a God. Even with our shared sin of pride, these 6 species trouble me, as they should trouble all faithful humans. Are we more moral for our flawed biology, which forces us to choose the just path? Or are these others, our galactic compatriots who lack our temptations, a more perfect image of God? I cannot help but fear we are God's rough draft, and each of these species outlined in my epistle were corrections to our flaws. Our benevolent Creator did not erase us in a great flood, but we were left to toil in our tainted forms as He breathed life into more perfect creations. Have we been forgotten, or even forsaken? Do our flaws pull us further from God? I may never learn the answer. We, as humanity, may not be meant to learn it. A shameful part of my being yearns to return to ignorance. Had I been gifted with foresight, I might have argued to keep the archives of galactic knowledge locked. As I sit with these hard truths, I am obliged to conclude that angels must walk among us, somewhere in the galaxy. As yet undiscovered, there must be a species whose very nature, very biology, glorifies God, without the possibility of mortal pride. They may be the fabled people who founded the GCI to usher the galaxy into an era of unprecedented cooperation and community. The ultimate and most perfect people created could have been the first to be breathed to life, for what is time to our God? I do not request any action be taken following this report. I cannot in good conscience recommend a continuation, an amendment, or an abandonment of faith, because I continue to believe that human mind is not meant to know the ultimate plan, be it spiritual or physical. I simply submit my report that all members of the faith can draw their own conclusion. I take comfort in a galactic addendum to Pascal's wager. A galactic confederates could be proof of our divine abandonment, but they could also be proof of our unique relationship to our Creator. I choose to believe the latter, because only good can come from that choice of faith. And so I will continue to toil in service to my order and in deference to my Creator. I may be doomed to toil as a lowly animal, but my very curiosity tells me I have a soul, if only a flawed one. So that brings the story to a close. The questions are, number 1, the story opens by telling us that Earth has withdrawn from the international community and suppressed galactic knowledge to re-establish a purely human society. Are there times when it is, or is not, appropriate to take special steps to safeguard a culture? What if traditional Earth music, art, or language was slowly dying off due to galactic influence? 2. The narrator says he previously believed temptation toward the cardinal sins must coexist with sentience. Do you think that is true? Do you think that sentience automatically gives rise to the temptation to sin? Do you have any evidence for or against your opinion? 3. Which species scenarios did you find most or least plausible for being true? For example, the Lumocelia of Sigma 3 do not, the narrator says, have wrathful thoughts or actions because there is no resource pressure or mate competition. You think without resource pressure or mate competition there would be no wrath? Or do you think there could ever be a scenario, via variations of the situations listed, where humans are no longer tempted by a particular sin? For example, if there were unlimited resources, would humans no longer feel greed? If mate selection were assigned, would we no longer feel lust? Is there ever a scenario where humans would no longer feel sinful pride? And then finally, number 5, the narrator says our galactic confederates could be proof of our divine abandonment, but they could also be proof of our unique relationship to our creator. If we found sentient life on other planets, how do you think that would affect humanity's or your relationship with God? If you believe, is it only because of Pascal's wager? Lots of really good questions there, and I won't necessarily be able to do all of them justice, but I'll raise a few comments here and there. I will say one thing before I sort of get into the questions. I enjoyed the author's, well, not terribly subtle, but subtle references to Brexit and the EU in the story. I found that quite amusing, and I suspect that my attitude to Brexit and the EU is the same as the authors. Anyway, we'll leave that aside for this video. So turning now to the questions, and the first question is again about whether it's appropriate to withdraw from the international community and to suppress galactic knowledge to re-establish a purely human society, and is it ever appropriate to take special steps to safeguard a culture? And I guess my instinctive thoughts on that are that I'd kind of take a sort of evolutionary approach. I don't see cultures as stagnant things that must remain forever pure and unchanging. They naturally evolve, they naturally interact with other cultures, and the goal, I think, should not be to preserve a culture in a sort of a fossilized state. Instead, it should be to take the best bits of all the cultures we interact with and to advance and evolve our culture in positive ways. So basically, no, I don't ever think it would be appropriate to take special steps to safeguard a culture. I think that fetishizes cultures rather than seeing them as evolving, progressing, changing things. I guess the only exception I would make, of course, I think this sort of goes without saying, is that if one cultural society was oppressing and trying to destroy another culture, then yes, it is appropriate to preserve and protect the culture that's being attacked and destroyed, but not in the sort of scenario they're thinking of here. That's a culture being violently destroyed, not a culture gradually evolving as it interacts with other cultures. So in the scenario they're thinking about, no, I don't think it would be appropriate to take special steps. The only times that would be appropriate is when there's actual destruction and oppression going on through violent means. I'll skip out the second question. I think it's an interesting question, but I've got more to say about the other questions. So I'll skip out the second question and go straight on to question 3, which is, which species scenario did you find most or least plausible for being true? For example, the Lumocelia of Sigma 3 do not, the narrator says, have wrathful thoughts or actions because there is no resource pressure or mate competition. If you think without resource pressure or mate competition, there would be no wrath. So I think that's a really good question. The ones I found most plausible were the ones about gluttony, where the species couldn't be gluttonous because consumption of foodstuffs happened automatically, and when they were satiated, they physically couldn't eat anymore or consume anymore. So I thought that one was plausible. It'd be like, can a plant be greedy? No, plants don't consume consciously, and so they can't be gluttonous. Another one that I found plausible was the idea of lust. Obviously, in species that don't produce sexually, there won't be sexual desire, so there couldn't be lust. So I found those two very plausible, and we can imagine, I think, sentient species existing that don't suffer from those sins, those vices. With regards to the ones I found least plausible, I think probably wrathful thoughts or actions. It seems to me that although humans often did get angry in the past and still get angry today due to resource pressure and mate competition, it seems to me there are a whole variety of other reasons why we might evolve the ability to get angry and thus the ability to suffer from wrath. The most obvious sorts of reasons the ability to get angry might evolve would be if you're a creature that has goals, which you don't even need to be sentient to have goals, and other species can frustrate those goals. It makes evolutionary sense to get angry at them, because then you'll stop them from frustrating your goals. And those goals don't have to be tied to mate selection or resource competition. So it seems to me there's a variety of ways that the ability to get angry might evolve, a variety of reasons why the ability to get angry might evolve, and the moment that you have the ability to get angry, the possibility of wrath rears its head and becomes possible. So I found that one, I think, the least plausible. Turning now to the fourth question, do you think that there could ever be a scenario via variations of the situations listed where humans are no longer tempted by a particular sin? For example, if there were unlimited resources, would humans no longer feel greed? If mate selection were assigned, would we no longer feel lust? Is there ever a scenario where humans would no longer feel sinful pride? And I think my answer to that is basically no. These sins, these vices, are part of us because they evolve a corruption of something that is a good part of us. Sexual desire is not bad, but an excess of that directed towards the wrong object or person is sinful, and that is at least the beginnings of lust. Likewise, there's nothing wrong with desiring food, but desiring too much food, that's gluttony. And I think we can go through all the vices he lists here, and we can link them to something that is a desire in human beings that is good, but which can be corrupted. And those desires are now part of us, and so the corresponding vices are always going to be a problem for us. There may be ways of limiting our risks of falling into those vices. I don't think they can ever be completely eradicated. And with the examples they give, for example, if there were unlimited resources, would humans no longer feel greed? I think that would lead to more greed, because we'd constantly be desiring more and more, and we could constantly have more and more. And it seems to me that that would distract us from the things in life that actually make it meaningful, which is not material possessions. It's relationships, it's morality, it's beauty, it's potentially religion, it's knowledge. These are the things that make life worth living, not material resources. And I think an excessive desire for material resources, that is greed. And if we had unlimited resources, I think we'd all end up becoming very greedy very quickly, because we demand more and we'd be given more, and then we demand more and we'd be given more, and so on and so forth. Again, if mate selection were assigned, would we no longer feel lust? I mean, there are plenty of cultures where they have arranged marriages, so that's kind of where mate selection is assigned. They have just as much lust as societies where we choose our own husbands and wives, so I just don't see why that would make any difference. And then the final example they give is, there ever a scenario where humans would no longer feel sinful pride? Which I think the answer to that is no. We have a sense of self, and corresponding to that comes a desire to better ourselves and to be good people. But of course, we then compare ourselves to others and so on and so forth, and value ourselves, and we can do that in unhealthy ways. And when that's done in an unhealthy way, that's pride. Turning now to the fifth and final question, the narrator says our galactic confederates could be proof of our divine abandonment, but they could also be proof of our unique relationship to our creator. If we found sentient life on other planets, how do you think that would affect humanity's or your relationship with God? I think that's a really interesting question, and I'm a Christian, and it's one of the questions that's fascinated me for quite some time. And sometimes it's troubled me, and sometimes it's sort of excited me and made me curious to think through the answers. I think ultimately now I've done enough research on this, both at an academic level and at a sort of personal fun level, that this would no longer particularly trouble me. I think there are lots of different ways we as Christians could understand the existence of other sentient life forms. How we would understand them, I think, is open to debate. You'd kind of have to cross that bridge when we came to it. We'd have to look at how they existed, what their religious beliefs were, if any, how much they differed from us, and so on and so forth. But there are lots of different models for how we might interpret their existence from a theological point of view. And if you're interested in this question, one series of books that I would recommend is by C.S. Lewis, his Cosmic Trilogy. And the first one in that series is called Out of the Silent Planet, and that explores this very question. As you may know, C.S. Lewis was a very committed Christian and became something of a famous Christian apologist later on in his life. And in this Cosmic Trilogy, he explores the exact question of, could there be, in a Christian worldview, sentient life on other planets, and how would we understand that? And he develops a lot of really interesting ways of understanding that. So I won't go into too much detail because I wouldn't want to ruin the books for you. But I would say check those out if that question interests you. And the second part of question 5 is, if you believe, is it only because of Pascal's wager? If you don't know, Pascal's wager was put forward by Pascal, and he suggested that we should believe in God because if we're right, we get heaven, and if we're wrong, we end up going to hell. And so if you gamble on God existing and you win, you gain heaven, and if you lose and God doesn't exist, you lose the time you spent in church, but you're dead, so you haven't lost a huge amount, just the time you spent in church. On the other hand, if you gamble on God not existing, God does exist, you get an eternity of hell, which is pretty terrible. And what you gain, if you're correct, you only gain the time you saved from going to church. And so he thinks, because the costs are so different and disproportionate, you should assume that God exists. And I guess my answer to that question is no, I don't only believe because of Pascal's wager. I think there are lots of good philosophical arguments for the existence of God. And at some stage, I may do a video on some of those. And if you want me to, then let me know in the comments. So that's it for these questions. I hope you enjoyed the story, and I hope you found my musings on the questions interesting. If you have any thoughts, and do let me know in the comments. I may not necessarily respond to every comment, but I'd be interested in hearing what you think. The magazine editors have given me a discount code, which I shall include in the video description. So do have a look at that, and then if you go over to their website, you can get your first month's edition for free. So do check them out if you haven't already, if you haven't seen my first video in this series. So I think that's it for this video. I've got another one lined up, and then we'll see how that's received and how this is received, and then maybe I'll do some more stuff with them, maybe not. Either way, I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll look forward to seeing you in the next video. Take care. Goodbye.